Yeah, we're good to go, and the moves surely will begin shortly. Magnus, what are we expecting from the opening? Will he, with white, take a solid approach, just ease his way into the match? He plays pawn to g3, Robert, not his traditional e4, not occupying the center. A frown from Magnus. He's snacking up or drinking something, but g3, is that a surprise?
It's certainly a surprise, but when Magnus Carlsen is playing, you just can't expect anything. And I know that sounds cliche, but it's true. The best players in the world, they can play any opening under the sun. They can throw their rook pawns forward on the first move, which is inadvisable, so don't do it yourselves. Don't try this at home. But Magnus Carlsen has won Title Tuesdays playing his rook pawns on the first turn. And David, we have no pawn tension yet, and finally we do. The pawn comes up to c4. This is familiar territory. It resembles a Catalan opening mixed with the Grunfeld.
That's right. It's a real hybrid here, and it looks like a belated Queen's Gambit. This pawn can simply be captured. The pawn that's just landed on c4 for white, but it will be regained in short order. White's queen can come out, or the white knight on b1 can come out and snap off that pawn. So Firouzja here deciding to go for the solid path. The solid option just sets up a kind of pawn center there with black. Now it's a mix, kind of a mishmash, Robert, between the Grunfeld and the Slav defense. And finally, a pawn sacrifice from Magnus. He doesn't care. He doesn't even try to regain the pawn, just occupies the center instead. He has used this in the past with success. What do you make of this? I thought he would ease his way in, but he's already kind of going for a really controversial idea here with white.
Controversial is a good way of putting it. I think that Firouzja should be happy because he didn't actually have to bring the fight to Magnus. Magnus allowed this position to be reached. And what we have to note is that white is a pawn down. Black has successfully defended the extra pawn, the Queen's Gambit pawn, so to speak. And white is occupying the center. Look at this latest move, d5. This rook on d1 is behind a pawn. Now it's been captured. David, I love positions like this. And Alireza, if he's not careful, he could be in trouble, but he's ignoring and sacrificing his knight. What a position we have.
What a position, and it is a familiar position. I do believe Magnus has employed this before in the Champions Chess Tour, actually, or at least a very similar idea. He's a piece to the good, but 3 pawns for black. It's a matter of timing. If black can motor those pawns forward, the E, D, C pawns, if they start running, then they will simply steamroller the white position. But for now, a piece is a piece. White has an extra bishop, so who will be able to utilize their strengths here. For white, the ace up his sleeve is the bishop, potentially the bishop on g2. For black, it is that mass of pawns, that horde of pawns. And Robert, this is guaranteed to be a fight. Both players clearly well prepared by the kind of speed with which they've been playing. Thank you for connecting for there. I love that. I love that pawn chain for black. This one, wow, we couldn't have hoped for a more exciting beginning to this game.
No, it's a clear imbalance. The extra bishop for white on g2, those 4 pawns that we just highlighted for black. And so let's try to talk about the outline of this position. That white is up a bishop, a long-range piece that sounds really good, but black has this fort of pawns. That bishop's not gaining any active space. So what white needs to do is sort of chisel open some lines for the pieces. There is direct access to a square like c6. Maybe this a5 pawn will be targeted later. And look at Alireza says, well, what a5 pawn? I am going to keep rushing those pawns up the board. David, we could see a passed pawn in the very near future.
Yeah, Robert, we could see 1 pass pawn, maybe 2 pass pawns, maybe even 3 pass pawns for black, depending on how white reacts right now. That is the definition of ambitious. Pawn to a4. He's not even trying to prepare things, build up. Normally in chess, it is the ultimate war game. After all, you need to just kind of organize your army before lashing out, before going in and moving in for the kill onto your opponent's terrain. But right now, he's just said go. And pawn to a4, it looks really loose, I've got to say, this last move for black. But if white cannot win those pawns, if white cannot prevent the creation of passed pawns, then Magnus will start sweating. And you see him on the camera, it doesn't look entirely comfortable yet. He's a minute down on the clock. This is just sparkling preparation from black here, from Alireza Firouzja. Full credit to him. Like you said, Magnus is taking the fight to him, but he's not backing down at all. He's taking significant risks. Most players, myself included, prefer to play solid with the black pieces, especially against these top grandmasters. Minimal risk, but who cares if you're Alireza Firouzja? And so many easy moves. Queen to b6 now looks like the best way to get out of the hit. And I guess Robert Magnus is trying to trade off pawns, seek some solace there.
He has to. I just don't think you can allow these black pawns to stay anymore. So he grabs this b4 pawn, which was loose only because Alireza pushed the pawn to a4. So this takes preparation. This takes deep understanding of a position to give up a pawn that is slightly closer to the center and just push your rook pawn forward. But at this stage, I think for Magnus, it's about solidifying. Bishop to d2. I like that choice. However, the b2 pawn will be in danger down the line. I mean, if this knight could successfully get to e4, black would be in business. However, that knight will be chopped off right away, and that also hurts black's pawn structure. So for now, black can't just go full steam ahead, can't press all the pieces forward. This is a really difficult position to decipher, David. I think that I would rather have the black side, but I feel like I'm going to regret those words.
You're right, Robert. It is one of those positions. I think we'll be changing our assessment, our evaluation move by move, because it is wild. The game has been super high quality up to this point, really high accuracy because it's mainly been preparation. But as the featured chat says there, the pawns are coming, the mistakes will likely come later down the line because it is a bit irrational, this position. It's very rare to find yourself with this material imbalance with such strong pawns for either side. And okay, Alireza, for the first real time in this game, having a longer think. What do you feel is going through his mind, Robert? What is he aiming for next, or is he just enjoying this position?
He told us he takes a step back with his knight to take 2 steps forward. That knight can jump into c5, and then there are juicy squares like d3 and b3 for that piece. But look at Magnus. He has an extra minor piece, a piece that's worth 3 points in value versus those 3 pawns. And so he's trying to get rid of this bishop in front of the black king. Will we see Alpha Magnus? h4, h5? That looks feasible to me at the moment. And this knight on b4, David, it's kind of like an outposted knight. A pawn can't kick it away. So if black ever takes on c3 and the pawn takes back, you feel like you have a well-defended piece. However, you are allowing an outside pass pawn, which can be scary. Every single turn has some pretty major consequences.
Yeah, huge consequences and therefore significant decisions here. And I mean, Magnus rightly spending time. You don't want to trade on the opponent's terms. You made a really good strategic point there, Robert. Black's pawns are pretty much all on light squares. Therefore, the dark squared bishop is the commander of that color complex, has to be traded off, but you don't want to rush. The white knight would feel really uncomfortable without its bodyguard, its protector on c3. So I love your move, pawn to h4. Other moves that come to mind would be maybe rook to a3, just in case. You don't want to allow that black a pawn to push. Queen to e3, just controlling those dark squares, fighting for territory. Yeah, so tense, so many decisions, so many tempting candidate moves here. But Magnus, yeah, do you think the clock's going to play a big role in this one? It's relatively simplified, lots of exchanges already, Robert, but super complicated.
I think it's difficult for white to come up with a plan, and that's why Magnus is sitting and thinking here. You can make any of the moves that David mentioned, and here he goes, Alpha Magnus style, pressing the pawn forward. And the queen for black is divorced from the king. And David, you've mentioned this so many times, and it's a very good point, that if black finds his king under some danger, he won't be able to withstand some of this pressure. For instance, if you play h5, white immediately strikes with g4, and you're just trying to break open the side of the board where both kings sit, and white's queen will enter, black's queen is far away.
Yeah, I sometimes feel like I'm a broken record just repeating the phrase, but it keeps happening, Robert. This entire Division 1 of the Chessable Masters, so many times players have actually been directly checkmated, but every time it's because their queen's on the wrong flank, on the wrong side of the board. And I'm looking at the black queen right now. It's not too happy. It is somewhat stifled by the white knight alone. And we said no obvious moves for Magnus, or at least nothing stood out. But he clearly has plans with this last move. Pawn to h4, really inspired. I love that phrase. I'm going to steal it. Alpha Magnus. And will Alpha Alireza now be able to do something with his a-pawn potentially? Suddenly no obvious moves for black either. Suddenly a bit of a dead end for the pawn chain.
And perhaps that means that Magnus has the upper hand here, because these rooks, they're connected for black, but where are you really going to move them? They're all not finding open files, and the only open file is the B file, and this one little knight here will stop a queen and a rook because the bishop defends it, or a pawn will replace the bishop to keep that knight safe and sound. So in comes the black knight. David, I think we can see a future plan for black to march those pass pawns forward. The question becomes, do you blockade this a pawn with your rook and then say, I know my rook is passive, but at least your pawn isn't getting anywhere? Or do you try to keep your rooks connected some more playing down the line? I would be too afraid. I'm just going to be honest with you. I'd be too afraid to move my rook and see this passer become unopposed.
I totally agree. And Magnus didn't want to move his rook at all. He didn't want to save it. He takes a bishop instead. Now white's knight is hanging and the rook in the corner is hanging. So he needs to justify this double attack. He needs to get out of it somehow with gain of tempo. Alireza, I think the threat of pawn to d4 there was just too strong. So Magnus reacts concretely. And this is the CCT, the Champions Chess Tour, Robert. Now you have to look for CCT, checks, captures, and threats. So I'm looking at knight takes d5. I'm looking at the check with queen to e5. What do you think is going through Magnus's mind?
It's a bit surprising to me that he would take on g7 and then think, but it's a very good point from you that white can't do nothing. Your rook is under attack, so if you move your rook away, you drop your knight on b4. If you move your knight, you lose the rook. And remember that black already has 3 pawns for a bishop, so black would actually be the one for a choice in the event of a knight retreat. So instead of retreating, going forward, getting aggressive, giving back some of your extra material. That's an important lesson that many in our audience should learn, that sometimes when you are ahead, you should think about changing the imbalance. And here knight takes d5 is one way to do it, just to take back with your rook next and get some activity. But David, I'm not entirely sure I'm buying it. And I'm not sure Magnus is buying it either because he's slowed down.
He's slowed down and it's getting dramatic. 4 minutes sounds like a lot. It is a lot in simplified positions, but this is still crazy. It's really chaotic. And white's knight or the rook in the corner, one of them is going to drop. That's why I was suggesting knight takes d5, Robert. I just felt like the knight is going to fall. You might as well sell it for the highest price. But you're right. I mean, black is going to be a pawn up in those ensuing positions. Black has this wall of pawns still. He delivers a check first, Magnus. And now the question is, okay, I was going to ask the question. The blue arrow, the all-seeing oracle, suggests pawn to f6, breaking the pawn chain, breaking that beautiful light squared structure of pawns, giving up e6, but gaining time in the process. How easy do you feel this is, Robert? Apparently the best move, but black could also be justified pushing his king back to safety.
Well, Alireza, he answers before I can. I think this made perfect sense because if the black king had moved back a turn ago, white would have had a free hand at an attack. So at least this forces the issue. The queen was under attack. It had to move. It captures the pawn on e6. And now for Alireza, he can take this knight over here on b4. But the point from Magnus is he wants to take on d5 and go right after this exposed king on the 7th rank. So we could see a material imbalance where white could be down a rook, but the checkmating attack, it can be immensely powerful. This is anybody's game at this point. And Alireza, he does take that knight. That knight could have saved itself had it not been captured. So the material count currently sits at 2 extra pawns for black. d5 is loose. The rook on a1 is hanging. The king on g7 is under attack. This is Carlsen Firouzja. This is the type of chess that we love to see between these two.
Yeah, Firouzja playing with fire and rook sacrifice from Magnus Carlsen. You called it. It's on the board. A double exclamation mark. It's a significant sacrifice now. If the black knight does take that white rook in the corner, it's so far offside. The black queen and king still divorced. It feels like there's checkmate, Robert. I think at the very minimum, after a check, white could also take that black rook in the corner with that assassin, that white bishop on g2, which has been lurking the entire game. And even if there's no knockout blow, you might be able to win some material back, deflect black's army. This has been really well calculated by Magnus. And Alireza, he leans back, scratches his head. I think he might have underestimated this. I think suddenly he realizes there's huge trouble around that black king. Yes, the evaluation bar is still level, but he's the one walking the tightrope now, Robert.
If we can quickly bring up an analysis board, it's instructed to show what happens if this rook on a1 is captured. I do not think that Alireza is that brave, and sometimes bravery costs you. So knight takes a1, you're going to see the evaluation bar change, and there it goes, because rook d7 check. The black king can run forward, but that walks into other checks. You don't want your king so out in the open. You'd rather retreat to the corner. But once this happens, David's eyes are good. He wears glasses for a reason. Bishop takes rook, and the rook cannot capture this bishop. This looks like would be good for black, but unfortunately for you, you get checkmated directly. Queen takes pawn, check. The king moves over, and the queen slides in front of the king with mate, thanks to a rook on the 7th rank. So, David, this is a rook sacrifice, but it's a rook that we've just shown cannot be grabbed, and that's why rook a7, protecting the king, is a smart try. But here comes that second rook. David, I feel like Magnus, he's feeling it right now. He's sacrificed a pawn overall, but in comes a rook on the 7th rank. seventh heaven, but only for the player with the white pieces.
Yeah, and you have to be so careful here, Firouzja. We see another blue arrow pop up. So rook to f7, the only saving move here for black, the only way to keep the game going. You have to simply curl up into a ball, shut up shop, and try to survive this onslaught. You need to defend your own rook. Again, save the 7th rank, protect it. And I think you need to guard the f6 pawn simultaneously, Robert. Of course, he finds the best move, the only defense, and he forces a trade of rooks. That will come with a sigh of relief. Huge move there found by Firouzja. He's defending well, and he's a pawn up still. So if he survives this onslaught, it's not going to be easy. Then he can look to the future with confidence. I was going to say which way to recapture. He takes back with a rook. And now Magnus, either he has to retreat or he trades off a second pair of rooks. Queen and bishop versus queen and knight. Often favour the queen and knight when they combine, but they're still on the wrong flank, on the wrong side of the board. Who do you feel is playing for a win, Robert?
Well, look at that exclamation point for king out into the open, king h6. The black king would have been all alone in the corner, and this move, bishop d5, would have actually been more harmful had the king been back on h8. So who do I favor here? I favor having a safe king. The white king is not in danger, but perhaps black can bring this queen down, follow it up with a knight to d2, and then maybe the white king isn't so safe after all because it needs to stay attached to this pawn, this lonely little pawn on f2. So I believe that knight d2 should be played here, and in fact, only move for Alireza. And David, before we continue to go to X's and O's, can we just shout out the players for their 99+% accuracy in a position that has been this sharp the whole way through?
Wow, we talked about who would start faster, who would bring their A game. They both have in this final early days. And your move on the board, black is threatening some nasty checks, nasty mating ideas. Queen to f1 check, winning the f2 pawn. White doesn't have time to go on a checkmating odyssey of his own. Bishop to g8 does not work. That's white's idea, but it's too slow. Black delivers mate in 2 with queen to f1 check and knight to f3. So queen a7 now, Magnus's only move. Both sides walking that tightrope. Queen a7 defends the f2 pawn. So I think process of elimination, Magnus has to find it. I was expecting him to react kind of more dramatically there on the camera, Robert, because I think he missed this idea for black. He's lucky that queen a7 clings on. The queen defends the dark squares, the bishop defends the light squares. So black's attack not decisive, but this could still go either way.
And the fact that Magnus has not made his move already, it indicates to me that you're right, that he is fortunate at this point. He went forward, but he's the one with the less safe king. It doesn't seem that way, but there's a black king on h6, and yet there's no check against it. And this knight d2 move and queen a7, another accurate response. I mean, these players are playing extraordinary chess. It's not something that I say lightly. Every single move has been an accurate decision. And this queen on a7 for white, if it can come back to d4, there are threats against this black king. Bishop to g8 is not available. I just want to quickly show that if we can, while we just Alireza's on the clock, that your point is really well taken, David, that a bishop to g8 move would actually lose the game for white right away. So I'm just going to show what happened in the event of the bishop leaving. Queen check, king h2. The white queen does protect f2, but the bishop was needed to protect f3. That is a checkmate. The queen takes care of these squares, and the king is hunted by this knight on f3. So this would be devastation for Carlsen. He is not going to fall into anything like that. But I think, David, your point is super well taken, that Alireza, his king is somehow safer, and it's the white king that always needs tending to from both the queen and the bishop.
That's right, and I think Alireza here, he's working out who a queen exchange might favour. White does have the option at some point of throwing a queen to e3 check-in, and yes, black is a pawn up on the queen side, but if black's pawns don't run, then white's king will journey over. Bishops thrive over knights with pawns on both flanks. The black knight almost trapped actually behind enemy lines if the queens disappear. I think otherwise, Alireza would have already played the most natural move. Queen to e5, centralization for black. Preventing your main idea there, Robert, queen to d4 is probably white's next move if you do nothing. So I like queen e5, hitting the bishop, hitting the pawn on b2. He's just calculating endgames. He's calculating whether this move allows bishop to g8, for example. And in the end, he does play the most instinctive move, but backed up by calculation. The clock's, though, getting dramatic. 1 minute against just under 2 minutes. And what are you predicting here? It feels like a draw still far, far away. Maybe even the least likely result. It's still, Robert, so much drama on the board.
These positions always amuse me because the engine says, yeah, take your choice. 7 options, all of them are equal. And then you make a move like bishop g8 without the computer by your side, and queen e4 check, and it's the white king that gets in danger. So you look at Magnus, queen c5, the engine, it doesn't budge. The best move, king g7 back, not allowing the queen to deliver a check. So both sides continue to play perfect chess. But I will say that it does feel like black's position is better. You're up a pawn. Suddenly there are threats like a3 trying to take advantage of this one little pawn on b2. It is covering both of black's extra passers on this side. So one pawn takes care of 2 until I throw away a pawn just to spring free a passer. I think I would do it now, David.
Yeah, I think that's a great call, Robert. Magnus does have this mechanism up his sleeve, though. I'm really surprised to see this last move, queen to a5. I thought this was the perfect moment to bail out, to escape with a draw. Queen to a7 check, forcing the black king back to h6, queen back to c5, threatening queen to f8, and we'll see a dance between the white queen and the black king, replying to the queen's threats. But Magnus, this last move indicates he's playing for more. But risk is involved if you play for a win in such a wild position, especially with kind of mutually vulnerable kings. And your move on the board, nice call, deflecting that b pawn. And no more b for bodyguard there. The black c pawn, therefore, will be allowed to run through. I think Magnus will be regretting this decision. The b pawn, once it takes on a3, what else simply? You can't take with the queen, you've got to protect your bishop. Then it's just a race, and black is clearly ahead in the pawn race.
And important to note that the knight on d2 can be captured, but that's how you lose games, because black will take back on b2. You could probably even push the pawn to a2, and the bishop on d5 will be loose in the end, while the white queen does everything it can to stop the runaway pass pawn. So less than 30 seconds for white in this game. He does take Alireza. He pretty much pre-moved the pawn to c3. So where is the draw? I see the engine saying it's equal, and I guess, David, it's your plan from earlier. The black king is a bit too out in the open.
Yeah, with such a weak king, it's going to be hard to play for a win. Otherwise, Firouzja could push his c-pawn, but it looks like that's playing with fire. It looks like you're really living life on the edge. I don't actually see the checkmate, I've got to admit, Robert, after pawn to c2, trying to deflect the white queen away from the defense of her bishop. But Alireza, under 20 seconds now, surely he cannot take that risk. The professional approach, the recommended approach, would be to retreat the king, repeat once, and then decide, but he's pushing. He's allowing Magnus to go for mate, and Magnus has blundered.
Oh, and Magnus missed this simple, quiet pawn move. The black king is safe. There's no bishop check because of the knight, and the bishop will be hanging if the queen tries to stop the c-pawn, but he can't even do that because the only square is covered by the black queen. Is completely winning for Firouzja now.
Wow, don't try this at home. The black king is literally living life on the edge, but Magnus can't checkmate it. He's not in time. There's nothing to do. Black makes a new queen. 2 queens are better than 1. This is going to be a win for Alireza. It was a perfect game until this one moment, and Magnus finally reacts, shakes his head. He knows this is gone. One mistake, and
he resigned.